What's up, Savvy Expats? If there's two places that I hold near and dear to my heart, that's the Windy City, where I grew up, and BONIFACIO Global City, where I've been living for the past 4 years. But it goes without saying that these two places are vastly different from each other. So, with that being said, what are the differences between these two metropolises, and which city do I prefer living in? But before we get into that, if you want to spare yourself of the obstacles, hassles, wasted time, effort, and energy that many expats face when moving to the Philippines, then the link to our guide is down below in the description, thesavvyexpat.com. Alright, now that that's settled, let's hop into our first order of business. So, the first undeniable and clear-cut difference between living in these two highly urbanized cities is, of course, the safety. Oh wow, Evan, who would have thought that living in BGC would be safer than living in Chirac? Yes, I know, that's like me saying the sky is blue. It's very obvious, but hear me out. To paint you a picture of what it's like living in Chicago, if I were just some clueless tourist roaming around and I happen to stumble upon the wrong neighborhood by accident, it could be over for me. But I tell you, there isn't a single part of BGC where I walk through it and I feel like my life is in danger. So, for all the expats that complain that BGC is a bubble, no kidding. The whole reason you're paying for BGC is because it's a bubble. You're afforded safety, convenience, cleanliness at its finest, all the while still being minutes away from the beauty of the Philippines. Meanwhile, I remember in Chicago when my family wanted to get the best and cheapest eats, which we all know just happen to be in these sketchiest neighborhoods, we would have to keep our head on a swivel. And so, needless to say, just look at the news and you'll see how high the crime rates are in Chicago. As a matter of fact, the whole reason why Chicago got its moniker Chirac is because studies shown that young men were more likely, for lack of better words, to get capped in Chicago than in war-torn Iraq. It's sad, isn't it? Imagine that. US military troops facing heavily engaged combat every single day in Iraq is more safe, statistically speaking, than a young man, for example, walking to his local convenience store in the south side of Chicago. To put it into perspective, from 2001 to 2016, the amount of homicides in Chicago reached 8,000. And from 2001 to 2016 in Iraq, the amount of homicides reached 4,500. God bless the fallen soldiers who have served and given their lives for our country, seriously, but my point being is that the violence in Chicago has gotten very out of hand. In 2022 alone, Chicago topped 2,600 shootings, more than both LA and New York combined. And this is the third largest city in the country. And now, I don't want to rattle off any more of these statistics because it's honestly so unfortunate how prevalent the violence is, not only in Chicago, but in all three major cities of the US. And granted, I did not grow up in the South Side or any of the extremely dangerous neighborhoods in Chi-Town, nor do I pretend to be from the rough and tumble. But I can confidently say in 2018, when we gradually started seeing more of these unfortunate events happening little by little, especially the near school shootings in the area, we knew we had to leave the US. It's a very sensitive topic, I'm sorry to bring it up, but that is one of the main reasons why we wanted to leave Chicago. I'll tell you, there wouldn't be a day where we turn on the radio or the news without hearing one of these unfortunate events and feeling very heavy-hearted from them. We originally thought that these homicides would only occur in the dangerous neighborhoods 20 to 30 minutes away, but gradually it started happening little by little in the surrounding suburbs near us. So I rest my case, living in BGC is much safer than where I formerly used to live in Chicago. Whether it be in broad daylight or late at night, I love having the peace of mind knowing that I can roam the streets living in a very safe city. Now, moving on to our second difference of living in Chicago versus Bonifacio Global City, that is the cost of living. Look, BGC may just be the most expensive city in the Philippines, with costs being on par with the West. It's far more expensive than Cebu and most definitely more expensive than any other province in the country. And most definitely I can see why some of your gripes may be pertaining to the high cost of living here. Because rightfully so, if I were from Arkansas, Indiana, or even Texas, of course I would perceive the cost of living here to be out of this world. But if you're from New York, California, or Chicago like myself and many other of the viewers on this channel, then the cost of living for you is going to seem relatively inexpensive. And I think that's why we love personally living in BGC, because in comparison to living in Chicago, our living expenses here are much lower. If we were, however, from a state like Ohio, for instance, of course the living expenses here in BGC would seem very expensive. And so a solid 80% of the viewers from this channel that I meet up with here in BGC are from California, and I also have one viewer that's also from Chicago. And more often than not, after speaking to many of these expats, the reason many of them move to BGC is because it's cheaper than where they're originally from, while still affording them the comforts of their home. I'm talking the Western conveniences of having access to any restaurant and store, the urbanized city infrastructure, the fast Wi-Fi, the safety, the cleanliness, you name it. But at the end of the day, our expenses were most definitely higher in Chicago. Paired with the taxes, the cost of our mortgage, our daily groceries, the gas prices, and our extracurricular activities, our expenses would easily hit $5,000 per month. And when I say easily, I mean easily. Any family living in New York or California for that matter can attest to this. But after moving to BGC, while it's still very easy to spend a lot, most of our overhead expenses went out of the window. Everything here in the city is walking distance and pedestrian friendly, so we don't need to own a car here. And when we do need a ride, we just book a Grab, which is basically the Uber of Southeast Asia. And the rent at our condo is substantially cheaper than our mortgage, and eating out is actually cheaper here than getting groceries in the US. That being said, that $5,000 we used to spend in Chicago is stretched a lot further here in BGC, even in the most lavish city in the country. That allows us to enjoy other activities like weekend trips to the province, eating out more often, massages, you name it. And so just like me, if you're from a state or a country that also has very expensive costs of living, then you can experience the same here in BGC as well. And that's great and all, but how do you know if BGC is the right city for you? At the end of the day, I don't want you to waste your time, effort, and money just for you to find out that this city is not for you. So that's why I created a completely free webinar for you down below so that you can save yourself all the time, effort, and money. This is a no BS webinar disclosing my cost of living here with realistic figures, my living expenses, as well as even the things you may not like about this city. I didn't want to post this video on the channel because it's only for those of you that are serious about finding the right place to call home in the Philippines. So if you want access to this free webinar, the link is down below. Moving on to the third most undeniable difference between living in BGC versus Chicago, that is the people. What do I mean by this? Well, in almost every realm imaginable, the average Chicagoan is very different than the average person living in BGC or even in the Philippines for that matter. First off, the way that we conduct ourselves in Chicago is very straight to the point. We're blunt, direct, and we don't beat around the bush. Especially when driving in the city, if you cut someone off, "What are you doing? Get out of the way, moron!" That's just the way that Chicagoans talk, and oftentimes it's not even personal. So, needless to say, Chicagoans don't spare feelings, and they wear their heart on their sleeve. Meanwhile, in BGC and even in the Philippines in general, it's common to save face here as per the Philippine culture. Humility and social awareness is a big part of the culture here. So if you do something wrong, many Filipinos tend to bring it up either indirectly or not even at all. A common way that Filipinos tend to avoid these tense conversations is by cracking jokes to lighten the mood. Now, I want to make this very clear. This doesn't apply to all Filipinos, but it's not uncommon for Filipinos to treat you very kindly and smile to your face, but behind closed doors, they may not like you, they may dislike you, and gossip about you behind your back. Then again, this can happen in any country you go to, but this is something that we personally experienced in the Philippines. You see, the social reputation of a Filipino matters very much here. You can especially see that with the manners here. But in Chicago, people address each other very bluntly in a very direct manner. We of course also can't deny that the beliefs in Chicago are different as a whole. It's pretty obvious that Chicago is one of the most liberal cities in the entire country. From the mayor running the city to the laws set in place, it's very left-wing. But here in the Philippines, this is definitely more of a conservative society. From the religious beliefs to the traditional family values, it's very old school here. Now, moving on to the fourth difference of these two cities, that is the cleanliness. The thing about Chicago is that downtown as a whole is pretty clean considering its size and population. That is, at least when I was living there. I'm not so sure after the riots and all that. But be it living in the Gold Coast or on Lakeshore Drive, I'd say that it's actually much cleaner than New York, for example. However, you'll still come across parts of the city with pockets of homelessness and trash lying around under bridges and in the alleyways. But the difference with BGC is that the entire city is quite clean. In Chicago, when you walk around, maybe there's a tent here, a tent there, a homeless man here, a homeless man there. Sadly, the same goes with Cali, as many of you Californians can attest. But in BGC, there's absolutely zero homelessness, zero tents on the sidewalks, and very little trash on the streets. This is not only what sets BGC apart from Chicago, but even the rest of Manila. You don't get the same level of congested traffic and breath-constricting air pollution here in BGC. With less cars on the street paired with the urban planning and the green parks, the air quality here in BGC is actually much better than the rest of Manila. Of course, it still isn't better than the air quality in the province, however. All in all, I think the relatively higher prices here is what allows BGC to have the organized streets and the cleanliness that you see today. If the prices here were low and just anybody can enter the city, you would see the same amount of trash and traffic that we see in the surrounding areas in Manila. So at the end of the day, I do believe you get what you pay for here. Now at number 5, perhaps the biggest difference for us and maybe even yourself too between these two cities is the taxes. It goes without saying that Chicago has some of the highest tax rates in the entire country. Whether you're buying or selling, the taxes must be heavily considered. To break it down for you, Illinois' sales tax is 6.25%. The country's tax rate is 1.75%, and Chicago's tax rate is 1.25%. In total, that's a combined tax rate of 10.25% in the state. So, needless to say, that would take a lot out of our pockets at the end of the day. But here in the Philippines, regardless if you're a resident or a non-resident, you're only taxed on your Philippine income sources. Many of you watching, including myself, have income sources from abroad, not from the Philippines. So if your retirement or your work is based out of your own home country, then you won't be taxed extra here in the Philippines. That is, unless you own a business here or you're employed by a Philippine company. Now, for the third obvious difference between these two cities is of course the pace of life. Although both are cities, Chicago is a type of city that is fast-paced and filled with energy. If you've been in New York, you know what I'm talking about. The city is filled with such a diversity of culture and characters. You feel the history of the city just roaming around, and there's just this unexplainable vibrancy. But here in BGC, especially because it's a relatively newer city, you don't necessarily get that vibe. As a matter of fact, the slow-paced island life seeped into the life here in BGC. While it is faster paced in the province, it is far from the degree of fast pace in Chicago. People are constantly on the go in Chicago, conducting business. I gotta be here, boom, I gotta be there, boom. If you strike up a convo, you must be direct, make it snappy because people have places to be, things to do. If you're ordering, order fast because you're holding up the line for that one intern getting coffee for the rest of the office. And if you're walking, walk fast because slow walkers in Chicago don't exist. But in BGC, although it is a business district with a lot of people working and conducting business here, there is a lot of leisure activities. So commonly, corporate employees are taking breaks at the local coffee shops, lounging at the cafes, or walking the parks. It's more chill and laid back here while still being a metropolis. All in all, Chicago residents are very fast-paced, while BGC residents are more laid back. Now, I couldn't end off this list without a specific bonus, perhaps the biggest thing that weighs on me till this day after leaving Chicago, and that is the food. Maybe because it was comfort food for me growing up, but I've never in my life had better food than in Chicago. Living in BGC, we of course have a taste of America. TGI Fridays, Shake Shack, Texas Roadhouse, you know, the typical eateries. But man oh man, I'll tell you, not a day goes by where I just don't stare into nothingness, drooling and craving the good old Italian beefs from Portillo's that are dipped, the thick crust sausage pizzas from Lou Malnati's, the Italian ice from Teddy's, Garrett's popcorn, Giordano's bar-style pies, Uno's pizza, Al's Italian beef, you name it. I really just can't explain the feeling of longing that I have for these comfort foods that I grew up with my entire life. I'll tell you, I am so satisfied with every area and aspect in my life living in Bonifacio Global City. But if there's one empty hole that has yet to be filled, that is the food. Don't get me wrong, the diversity of eateries here are definitely up to par, but growing up in Chicago, there is nothing that can replace what I grew up with my entire life. And so that wraps up the differences of living in Chicago versus Bonifacio Global City. Even as bad as Chicago is portrayed as on the news and even in real life, it'll always have a special place in my heart for what I grew up with. But at the end of the day, I enjoy the quality of my life and my lifestyle much more here in BGC. I don't even have to say it, but I definitely prefer living in BGC over Chicago. And again, if you want to save yourself time, effort, and money, and seeing if BGC is the right city for you to settle down in the Philippines, The link to our free webinar is down below. We spare no details and cut through all the nonsense that you might have heard about living in BGC. Also, our all-in-one guide to moving and living in Bonifacio Global City is also linked down below, thesavvyexpat.com. And so, thank you for watching Savvy Expats, and we'll see you in the next video. God bless.